Welcome to the Aboriginal channel. This episode will be part 3 to uncovering and exposing the burn you out tactic of colonization that occurred in originally Aboriginal dominant areas. So before we go into that, we got to get to the fact that Aboriginal people were very businesslike, and they, for a very, very long time, traded with Europeans and operated businesses, not out of tents, but out of storefronts. So right here, we're going into the book, The History of Alabama, and incidentally, that of Georgia and Mississippi from the earliest period by Albert J. Pickett in 1844. Okay, so right here is in the preface, the author is talking about some of his experiences down south with the Indians. So it says, in reference to that portion of work which relates to the Indians, I will state that my father removed me from Anson County, North Carolina, and carried me to the wilds of the Alabama Territory. In 1818, when I was a boy, but 8 years of age, he established a trading house in connection with his plantation. Pause. So this Caucasian man, who obviously owned other white slaves, moved from North Carolina to Alabama and established a trading house in connection with his plantation. Now, that means that the plantation and the trading house were one and the same. Basically, like I was saying, those forts, the colonies, settlements, trading house, plantation, they all mean the same thing. White man went down south with a bunch of other white slaves, and in a day's time, they could have one of those log forts built. But it was very important to establish a trading house because that's what the Indians were all about. So it says, during my youthful days, I was accustomed to be much with the Creek Indians, hundreds of whom came almost daily to the trading house. For 20 years, I frequently visited the Creek Nation. Their green corn dances, ball plays, war ceremonies, and manners and customs are all fresh in my recollection. In my intercourse with them, I was thrown into the company of many old white men called Indian countrymen, who had for years conducted a commerce with them. Okay, so it's talking about these old white men that conducted a commerce with the Indians for years. Some of these men had come to the Creek Nation before the Revolutionary War, and others, being Tories, had fled to it during the war and after it to escape from Whig prosecution. That means the runaway slaves. Remember, the white folks ran to the Indians. Okay. They were unquestionably the shrewdest and most interesting men whom I ever conversed. Generally of Scotch descent, many of them were men of some education. Okay. Basically, this man established a trading house in connection with his plantation. Now, did Indians have trading houses, or is that something that Europeans brought? We have to go deeper into the book to find that out. Right here it says, in Georgia and Alabama, the towns contain storehouses filled with rich and comfortable clothing, such as mantles of hemp and of feathers of every color, exquisitely arranged, forming admirable cloaks for winter, with a variety of dressed deerskin garments, and the skins of the marten, bear, and panther nicely packed away in baskets. Fond of trinkets, the natives collected shells from the seaside and pearls from the beds of the interior rivers. So basically, they already had businesses and storehouses, and because right here what I'm reading about was from the 1500s when De Soto first came through. Right here, see, it says 1540. So they already had storehouses and businesses prior to European contact. So a few rhetorical questions. One of them is, why did they call the white Scottish men who had been doing business with the Indians in Alabama for decades, why did they call them Indian countrymen? That's because they were the white men down in Indian country doing business with the Indians. Also, we know that they had storehouses in the 1500s. Those were the Indians in Georgia and Alabama. Did other Indians in other places throughout the Americas have storehouses? Yes. Now, if they had storehouses in the 1500s, by the 1800s, what did they have? Did they have full-blown business districts by the 1800s? Yes. But this is part 3 to exposing the burn you out tactic of colonization. So we're going to go back into some of the things that were burnt, but we need to know the climate and what was going on in the 1860s. So all over the so-called United States, Caucasians were invading, and basically under order of Indian extermination, they were massacring a bunch of Indians throughout this so-called nation. You had the U.S. Lakota Wars of 1860s. You had the California Indian Wars of the 1860s. And you also had what was called the so-called Civil War, which was also colonizers invading Indians and massacring Indians during that time. So in 1863, it says a great fire burned much of Denver's business district to the ground in 1863. Okay, so that area of downtown that burned in 1863 is very close to a place called the Harlem of the West, or 5 Points of Denver, Colorado. It says it was a traditionally African American area in the early 20th century. Now, they trying to say it wasn't a so-called African American area before the 20th century, but understand the wordage. Named in 1881 for a bustling five-way intersection, the 5 Points area became the commercial and social sector for African American churches, businesses, clubs, and homes, and the heart of Denver's black community. Now, if you go on a map, you'll see that this so-called 5 Points neighborhood, or the Harlem of the West, is blocks from where the Great Fire of 1863 occurred. Moving back to 1861. Now, this stuff is going down while the so-called Civil War was going on. The Indian Wars is going on, and the Lakota Wars is going on with these Caucasians. But right here, it gives a map of where the fire was. Now, if you look at this, this is the water. Where this fire is located is where Aboriginal Americans would always be. They would be inside of the turn of the river, which is basically right here. If you look at the historical so-called black neighborhood of Charleston, it's right here, right north of this area. But you had that fire. You can go read in it. It says, on the evening of December 11th, 1861, as a cold front bearing high winds swept into Charleston from the northeast, a fire started near the intersection of East Bay and Hassel Streets, about where Harris Teeter is now located. The origin is not for certain, but many accounts attribute it to some slave refugees who had started either a cooking fire or an outside open fire for warmth. Now, we're going to move all the way back to 1850 to the city of Philadelphia. It says fire on waterfront. The first great fire in Philadelphia's history began in the afternoon of July 9th, 1850, at a warehouse on the east side of Water Street between Vine and Ray Streets, near the Vine Street Wharf on the Delaware River. It says, as the fire happened before the 1854 consolidation of Philadelphia, the congested commercial dockside area was partly outside the Philadelphia's original city limits at Vine Street. About half of the zone of devastation was thus in northern Liberties. Well, let's go on down here just to see where the fire was at. It gives a little map right here. So this part of this, like half of this, was in northern Liberties. The other part is in what is called Center City. To get an understanding of how this fire burnt up Aboriginals' property, we got to look at a little bit of the history and the locations of the people inside of that city. So I asked the internet, where is the original Aboriginal community in Philadelphia? It says most lived in South Philadelphia near what is today Center City, but there were smaller populations in northern Liberties. It says they came because of Philadelphia's reputation as a thriving political, cultural, and economic center for African Americans. So Center City, which once again, the word center being synonymous with the original locations of Aboriginal settlements, says the Aboriginal people there were in Center City. Now that's what this looks like on the map. Center City. The fire was right here at the northeastern corner of it, right here. But the whole area from this waterway to this water, right here, this rectangular block, is Center City. Back in 1750, 100 years before that fire, this is what that little triangle looked like. And where the fire was is right here where this so-called courthouse is at. Remember, they destroyed the courthouses, or what they call courthouses were really Aboriginal settlements, and those big houses that the books say can contain 1,000 to 1,500 men. Here's a close-up of it. Now, these little squares right here, these individual little squares don't have buildings on them. That's because Aboriginal Americans built square gardens. Like, you got the word Madison Square Gardens. Well, when they pulled up to the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia, what they seen was very immaculate gardens that were in the shape of individual squares. So one square would have this growing on it, while the other square would have a different crop growing on it. So basically, and they used this kind of arrangement right here so they could get irrigation from both sides of the waterways. They would have an open square in it where they played the ball game, which is what you're looking at right here. So basically, this is what became Center City. Once again, it's right here on the map. Center City. See the outline of it right here? The water on this side, the water on that side. This was once all Aboriginals' owned and operated domain right there. Those square gardens look something like this. This is from the Smithsonian. It says Timeline of American Garden History. But basically, this whole area right here would be one square. Now, this right here is a little clip that I want to show. Is from the New York area, or the island of Manhattan. It says the Lenape of Lower Manhattan. All of these yellow little circles right here represent known and probable native settlements. Now, you see where they are inside of the turn of the river right here on both sides. You see where they would position themselves. So it correlates back to what I'm saying about these fires. Now, during the same time, right around 1850, you had what was called the Great Fires of San Francisco. So right here in the history of the San Francisco Fire Department, or the early history, it says San Francisco began its history in a baptism of fires. Harley had the gold rush of 49 assembled a nondescript collection of wooden houses, tents, the hulks of ships, anything, in fact, to afford protection to the ever-increasing multitudes gathering from the four corners of the earth. But a disastrous fire wiped out the most important part of the new city. Now, they want you to think that the city of San Francisco was new in 1849, but that's a lie. It's right there on the water, and it's exactly where Aboriginal Americans would have positioned themselves. He goes on to say that 6 fires in the first 2 or 3 years of her history caused the people to make extraordinary efforts to protect themselves against their recurrence. Okay, it goes on to say the first fire of any importance occurred in January 1849 when the Shades Hotel was destroyed. In June, following the ship Philadelphia was burned as it was preparing to sail for the Sandwich Islands. The inflammable material of which the town was built and winds made many thoughtful people realize that if a fire ever got started, nothing could stop it. It goes on to say the first of the great fires that visited San Francisco occurred at 6 o'clock in the morning of December 24th, 1849. Now, understand that these fires, they're either happening right around so-called Independence Day or 4th of July, or right around so-called Christmas or Christmas Eve. And that's not a coincidence. It says 6 months later, on May 4th, 1850, the second great fire occurred. It began at 4 o'clock in the morning, and by 11 o'clock, 3 blocks of the most valuable buildings in the city had been destroyed, with an attendant loss of property estimated to be $4 million. It was supposed to have been of incendiary origin. Several persons were arrested, but no formal trial took place. 1 month later, on June 14th, the third great fire started. It broke out at 8 o'clock in the morning for a defective chimney in a bakery. The wind was blowing, and in a few hours, the blocks between Clay, California and Kearny Streets to the water were one more in flames. The fourth Great Fire broke out about 4 o'clock in the morning on September 17, 1850. This time, it was estimated to be only $250,000 worth of damage. The blocks burned over were between DuPont, Montgomery, Washington, and Pacific Streets. But owing to the fact that the district had been burned over in a previous fire, there were only one-story buildings in the main that were destroyed. On October 31st of the same year, the city hospital was destroyed. It was supposed to have been the work of an incendiary. On the evening of December 14th, 1850, just a year from the first Great Fire, the fifth Great Fire, not considering one or two smaller ones, started. The total damage estimated at $1 million. On May 4th, 1851, the anniversary of the city's second Great Fire, the sixth Great Fire started. It was estimated that more damage was done at this one than all of the preceding ones. For 8 months, the citizens had enjoyed comparative immunity. Then at about 11 o'clock on May 3rd, a fire started in a paint and upholstery store on the south side of the plaza. This was again considered to have been of incendiary origin. The wind was blowing and at first carried the fire down to Kearny, then along Kearny for several blocks. Then the wind shifted and blew from the south and carried the fire into the main business district. The fire burned for the period of 10 hours. Between 1,500 and 2,000 houses had been destroyed. 18 blocks in the main business district had been destroyed. In order for us to understand that these fires in San Francisco wasn't set for any other reason but to displace the Aboriginal community, we got to look at the climate in the 1850s in the area of California. In order to do that, we're going to go over here to the list of Indian massacres in North America. So in 1850, in February, right there in Utah, it says Governor Brigham Young issued a partial extermination order of the Timpanogos who lived in Utah Valley. In the north, the Timpanogos were fortified. However, in the south, the Mormon militia told them they were friendly before lining them up to execute them. Dozens of women and children were enslaved, then taken to Salt Lake City, Utah, where many died. In May of 1850, you had what was called the Bloody Island Massacre. Nathaniel Lyon and his U.S. Army detachment of cavalry killed 60 to 100 Pomo people in Bomopote Island near Clear Lake. They believe the Pomo had killed 2 Clear Lake settlers who had been abusing and murdering Pomo people. This incident led to a general outbreak of settler attacks against and mass killing of native people all over Northern California. In 1851, January, says the gold rush increased pressure on the Native Americans of California because miners forced Native Americans off their gold-rich lands. Many were pressed into service in the mines, and others had their villages raided by the army and volunteer militia. Says the old Shasta town in 1851, miners killed 300 Wintu Indians near Old Shasta, California, and burned down their tribal council meeting house. In April of 1852, 70 American men led by Trinity County Sheriff William H. Dixon killed more than 150 Wintu people in the Hayfork Valley of California in retaliation for killing Colonel John Anderson. The Wright Massacre in November of 1852, it says white settlers led by a notorious Indian hunter named Ben Wright massacred 400 Modocs during a peace parley. In 1853, California settlers attacked and burned the Tolowa village of Hawaquet, murdering 70 people. In 1853, the Yotoke Massacre. A posse of settlers attacked and burned a Tolowa rancheria at Yontucket, California, killing 450 Tolowa during a prayer ceremony. Now, this was in Oregon, but it says 9 white settlers attacked a friendly Indian village on the Chetco River in Oregon, murdering 26 men and a few women. Most of the Indians were shot while trying to escape. The Chetco, who tried to resist with bow and arrows, were burned alive in their houses. In 1855, Klamath River massacres in California, it says, in retaliation for the murder of 6 settlers and the theft of some cattle, whites commenced a war of extermination against the Indians in Humboldt County, California. In 1856 through 1859, says white settlers killed over 1,000 Yuki Indians in Round Valley over the course of 3 years in an uncountable number of separate massacres. In 1858, in British Columbia, it says settlers killed dozens of Nakayapamak non-combatants and burned 5 villages. In 1859 and 1860, it says white settlers calling themselves the Eel River Rangers, led by Walter Jarboe, killed at least 283 Indian men and countless women and children in 23 engagements over the course of 6 months. They are reimbursed by the U.S. government for their campaign. So far, we talked about San Francisco, the city, and how it was baptized in fires. So we're going to look at where the downtown San Francisco area sits. Right here, downtown San Francisco sits at the bend of the river right here. Place that was burned over and over again in the earliest stages of European contact. Yeah, right here. But I want to jump back into the 1860s right quick just to give another example of how Europeans came to a place that was already inhabited by Aboriginal people and how they would burn the place, burn the people out of there. So in Idaho, the state of Idaho, you had what was called the Boise Basin. And right here it gives a little history. A place called Idaho City. It says it was with the 1862 gold rush to Boise Basin that the development of the state of Idaho began. It says in 1863, Idaho City had grown to 6,000 people and had 250 places of business. It says the height of the boom lasted from 1863 to 1866, but they had a decline. It says another major factor in the decline was the high loss caused by destructive fires. Fires hit Idaho City in 1865, which was 2 years after it came into existence, 1867, 1868, and 1871. Just like in San Francisco, they burned the people out of there. Now, one thing I didn't hit on is the tunnels. And all of these places have the tunnels. So we're going to start right here with Philadelphia, and just read a little something that was said. It says, the executive director of the American Women's Heritage Society Underground Railroad Museum at Belmont Mansion, Nelson was aware of talk that tunnels were possibly used for smuggling slaves into Philadelphia, or conversely, for sneaking fugitive slaves to freedom via the Underground Railroad. So they saying that the tunnels in Philadelphia were used for slaves. In San Francisco, it says the mysterious and creepy cave of San Francisco's Sutra Baths. This same tunnel features prominently in another local urban legend. San Francisco actually has a long past with Satanism, and it is told that dark rituals involving human sacrifices have been conducted in this very tunnel. Over here in Charleston, South Carolina, it says there are always some concerns about flooding if a storm hits Charleston, but city engineers believe they have a possible answer to help alleviate some of the stormwater. It's been right under our feet for nearly 200 years. In 1850, a yellow fever epidemic plagued Charleston, a disease so contagious 10 miles of tunnels were built under the city to remove infected waste away from the city into the harbor. Goes on to say that after the crisis passed, those tunnels fell into despair. So right here, they trying to say that the 10 miles of tunnels were built due to a yellow fever epidemic, which is a lie. But moving over here to Idaho City, it says, for the past 100 years or so, Boiseans have been tantalized by the thought that a network of tunnels was dug beneath the city by residents of Chinatown. Idaho Historical Society, none is more passionate than McKee himself, and he is most passionate about the existence of the so-called Chinese tunnels. So in Idaho, they're saying the Chinese built the tunnels there, which is also a lie. Through the history books, which has all been a lie. So therefore, if it's a lie, then what's the truth? If it's a lie, then what's the truth?